This machine is very easy to unpack. Always start with the handle away from you. Clamp the machine to a firm surface. It's no wheels because every time you knit a row, the machine will disappear down to the other end of the room. This is the tension mast. Look for the little arrow and push the mast up into position. You can then place it in the hole at the back of the machine. Put your ball or cone of yarn on the floor behind the mast and thread it up carefully. If you hold it firmly between both hands, you will be able to wind it through the guide loops. Be sure to get it behind the little pin on the back of the tensioning discs by pulling it firmly into place. The last guide is on the tension spring. This long wire is very useful because it pulls up extra yarn at the end of each row and keeps you from getting those nasty loops at the edges of your work. When you have finished, you can secure it behind the clip on the mast. Now let's look at the needle bed. There are 200 needles on this machine, and there is a number strip beneath them with 0 in the middle. From 1 to 100 on the left is orange, and 1 to 100 on the right is green. When the needles are at the back of the needle bed, they don't knit. They're in non-working or A position. When the needles are pushed out, so the edge of the hook they're in working or B position, and the carriage will knit them. If the needles are forward, so the open edge of the latch is in line with the edge of the needle bed, they're in upper working or D position, and when they're out as far as they can go, they're in holding or E position. Now we can remove the carriage lock lever and have a closer look at the carriage. This dial is called the tension dial and controls the size of your stitches. Number, small stitch, big number, big stitch. These buttons will help you to knit your automatic stitch patterns. This button is called the holding cam lever and is used for short rowing or partial knitting. This dial is your change knob and connects the stitch patterns automatically to the needles. You can also turn it right round, and you can take the carriage off the needle bed without having to slide it. Put the carriage back carefully. Remember to return the change knob to NL and make sure the carriage is securely connected both at the back and the front. The carriage fits under the guide at the back, and the lip of the carriage hooks over the front edge of the needle bed. This is a sinker plate. If we look at the underside of it, we can see the brushes and wheels that are very important for keeping our stitches on the needles, and they may need cleaning from time to time. These are the magnets for opening the latches on the needles. It goes on the front of the carriage and is secured with these 2 screws. Our first job is to get the yarn onto the needles, so we'll begin by casting on. I'm going to show you several techniques, and you've got to choose the one that works best for you. I'm using a 4-ply yarn, so I'll have my tension at 6. With the carriage on the right, take the 1x1 pusher out of your toolbox. We'll start with 0 in the middle, and we'll cast on the same number of stitches on either side. So from number 20 on the right to number 20 on the left, push all the needles to working position. You can feel them click into place. Run the empty carriage across the needles to line them up. Now, starting from needle 19 on the right, push alternate needles back to non-working position. Thread up the yarn. Open the gate, pass the yarn behind, and remember to close the gate again. Hold the yarn below the carriage, well clear of the brushes, or tie it to the clamp, and take the carriage across the needle bed. You can now see you've got loops on every other needle. Take your cast-on comb out of the lid. You can use either the short one, the longer one, or put them both together depending on how many needles you're using. We just need the short one for now. You've got to remember to position the comb evenly on your work. Holding the yarn clear at the edge of your work, place the comb on the machine. Lie it horizontally with the teeth between the gate pegs onto the loops and then let it swing down. Now pull up the yarn and knit the row. This is a closed edge cast on and will not unravel. Here's another way of casting on, which will give you a very nice finished edge. I'm going to use the latch tool this time. We'll use the same number of stitches we used last time. Push the required needles to holding position, Make a slip knot on the end of your yarn and slip it over the latch tool. Starting at the end needle on the side of the work away from the carriage, hold the tool below the needles and the yarn above. Push the tool up between the first two needles, grab the yarn in the hook and pull it down, then move the tool along and push it back up between the next two needles. Grab a loop of yarn and pull it down again. Continue this until you come to the last needle in holding position. Now you can slip the last loop onto the next needle. Now you can thread your yarn into the carriage. Pull the yarn up and you're ready to knit the first row. Now comes what I call the insurance policy. Remember the brushes on the bottom of your sinker plate that are going to push the stitches down off the needles? Well, you haven't got much knitting for these brushes to push down. So to help the carriage knit for a few rows, you can push the needles to holding position with your pusher in one hand while you push the work back against the machine with the other. Remember, you've got two hands, use both of them. For the last cast on, we will also start with the required needles in holding position. Make a slip knot on the yarn and slip it over the end needle on the side away from the carriage. Always work towards the carriage in this cast on. Now, using both hands, wrap the yarn under and then over each needle in turn. When you have finished wrapping a needle, hold the loop in place with your other hand. Make sure the loops aren't too tight, otherwise you won't be able to knit the first row. Remember, the loops have to be loose enough to slip over the closed latches. This cast on is called the E-wrap because it's like writing the letter E with the yarn. At the end, thread the carriage and knit the first row. Then, using your insurance policy, bring the needles to E or holding position before you continue your knitting. The transfer tool is used for moving a stitch from one needle to another. This is the easiest way to hold your transfer tool. You can see how easy it is to flip it up and down. Let the tool and the needles do the work for you, and always use both hands. Place the tool into the hook of the needle. Pull the needle forward, keeping the knitting back against the machine. Don't press down on the tool, just pull it gently straight out towards you. The stitch will pass behind the latch. Now simply push the tool, which pushes the needle back. The stitch slips over the closed latch and onto the tool. Tip the tool up. Let's move this stitch onto the needle next door. Place the eye of the tool into the hook of the needle and hold the knitting down with your other hand. Swivel the tool up and the stitch will just fall off onto the needle. Now you can practice this by making a row of holes. We'll move alternate stitches onto the needles next door. When you begin your garment, you'll need to knit a hem. I'm going to show you several possibilities. For a plain hem, we'll cast on with waste yarn. That is, another yarn which will then be removed when the garment piece is completed. Knit several rows in waste yarn, and then, with the carriage on the left, remove the waste yarn and thread up the cast-on cord. Knit one row. The carriage is on the right. Remove the cord. Set the row counter to 0. Now, thread up the carriage with your main yarn. To make the hem neat, we'll knit it in a smaller stitch size. So we're going to use main tension -2, that is 4 on the tension dial. Knit the number of rows you'll need for your hem. I'm going to knit 8 rows. Increase the stitch size for your fold row to main tension +1, that's 7 on our tension dial. Knit 1 row. Return the tension dial to main tension -2 and knit the remaining 8 rows of your hem. Now we're going to turn up the hem. If you look at the first row knitted in main yarn after the cord row, you will see a series of loops. These look like smiles. We're going to pick up each one of these smiles with our transfer tool and slip it up onto a needle. Remember to use both hands. Don't pull the needles out from the needle bed. Be careful not to drop the stitches over the gate pegs. Just swivel the transfer tool up, holding the knitting down with your other hand. When you've completed the garment piece, you can pull the cord out and the waist knitting will fall off. Now let's do a mock rib or a 1x1 hem. This gives the appearance of a 1x1 rib, but because it's doubled over, it's stronger and much more substantial. Push the number of needles you will need for the garment to working position. Then, using your pusher, push alternate needles back to non-working position. Cast on using waste yarn and knit several rows. With the carriage on the left, remove the waste yarn and thread up the cord. Knit one row with the cord. Carriage on the right, remove the cord and thread up the main yarn. Set the row counter to 0. Use a tension 2 numbers below your main tension and knit the number of rows you require for your rib. Knit one row on main tension plus 1 and return the tension dial to main tension minus 2. Then knit the number of rows for your rib. Push all the needles that you return to non-working position back up to working position. Now we're going to pick up the smiles again, but this time we'll only have half the number of smiles because we started on half the number of needles. So we'll put a smile on every empty needle. When you've finished the garment, you can pull out the cord and the waist knitting will fall off. Now we'll do another kind of hem. This is a 2x1 mock rib which gives a very attractive finish. First, push all the needles you'll require for the body of your garment to working position Then cast on in waste yarn and knit several rows. Carriage on your left. Now, leaving the 2 needles either side of 0 in the center in working position, first push every 3rd needle forward to holding position and then back to non-working position. You'll drop every 3rd stitch. If you've got 3 needles in working position at each end, you'll get a much neater join when you make your garment up. Knit 1 row in the cord, carriage on the right, thread up your main yarn and main tension -2, knit the number of rows you'll require for your rib. Knit 1 row on main tension +1 for the fold row. Return the tension dial to main tension -2 and then knit the number of rows you'll require for your rib. Push all your needles up to working position. Now we're ready to pick up the hem. You'll be picking up the smiles again, but this time you're only missing 1/3 of the needles. So start by missing the first needle and put a loop on the next 3 needles. This will happen only at the edge because of the extra needle. Next, you'll miss a needle and put loops on the next 2 needles. Miss a needle and put a loop on the next 2 needles again. Repeat this until you come to the other end. When you've finished the garment, you can remove the cord and the waist knitting will fall off. To give your garment shape, you'll need to increase and decrease. The easiest way of increasing is to push up an extra needle between the knitting and the carriage before you knit the row. The needle will pick up a loop of yarn. This is usually done one side at a time. Another way of increasing gives what is called a fully fashioned effect. This can be done at both edges at the same time. This time, let's use a triple transfer tool. You could use a double transfer tool if you want. First, take the 3 edge stitches onto the tool. Put the tool into the needle hooks. With your free hand below holding the knitting back against the machine, pull the needles towards you. Now with the tool, push the needles straight back. The stitches will slip off onto the tool. Lift the tool off the needles and tip it up. Move it over one needle and put the tool back into the needle hooks. Pull them forward to working position. While pulling the knitting down with your free hand, swivel the tool. The stitches will drop off onto the needle hooks. Now you could leave the empty needle as it is and have the hole as a design feature. But if we want to be a bit more traditional, we'll have to put a stitch on it. Look at the stitch below the needle next door. Pick up that stitch with your single transfer tool. Slip it in sideways and then turn it flat. Place that stitch onto the empty needle. Repeat this on the other side. Now you're ready to continue knitting. If you need to increase more than one stitch at the edge of the work, you can't use the transfer tool method at all. You'll have to cast on the stitches that you need. One of the best ways of doing this is to use your E-wrap cast on again. If you use the yarn you're knitting with, you'll only be able to do this one edge at a time, working on the needles between the knitting and the carriage. Push the needles you need to holding position. Using your yarn, write the letter E on the needles. Then knit the row. With the carriage now on the other side, you can repeat the procedure. Of course, on this side, you're going to have to write the letter E mirror image or backwards. First, under the needle, then over, but going in the opposite direction. Before you knit this row, though, let's go back and look at our first E-wrap on the other side. To ensure that these stitches will knit properly, we must use an insurance policy. This time, we'll push the weaving brushes on the sinker plate down. The simple decrease is quite easy using the transfer tool. Just move the edge stitch onto the needle next door and push the empty needle back to A or non-working position. The fully fashioned decrease gives a more decorative effect. We'll use the triple transfer tool. First, take the 3 edge stitches onto the tool. Put the tool into the needle hooks and with your free hand below holding the work back against the machine, pull the needles towards you. Push the tool straight back and the needles return to non-working position. The stitches slip over the closed latches onto the tool. Pull your empty needles back to working position and lift the tool off the needles and tip it up. Move it over one needle. Put the tool back onto the needles, and while pulling down on the knitting with your free hand, swivel the tool so the stitches slip down onto the needles. Remember to push the empty needle at the edge of your work back to non-working position. You can hang a claw weight at the edge of your work to prevent tight edges on your knitted piece. Casting off with your transfer tool is really just a kind of decreasing. You put 2 stitches on one needle and then knit the 2 together. Always use both hands. Transfer the end stitch onto the needle next door. The eye of the tool into the needle hook, thumb below. Pull the needle forward gently, don't press down with the tool. Push the needle straight back. Lift the tool off the needle. Move it over to the needle next door, making sure that the stitch passes behind the gate peg. Place the tool into the needle hook. Pull this needle out towards you so that both stitches are just behind the open latch. Now you can knit both stitches. Put your free hand onto the needle butt and pull it back until the yarn has been pulled through and makes a new stitch. Repeat this to continue casting off more stitches. If you want a chain stitch cast off, you'll have to use your latch tool. This cast off can sometimes be quite tight because the tension of the cast off depends on the difference between your main tension and the stitch size you've used in your last knitted row. Knit the last row on tension 10, the biggest stitch size. If you're right-handed, knit the last row from right to left, leaving the carriage on the left. Break your yarn. Push all your needles to holding position with your pusher. Remember to use both hands and only push a few needles at a time. Don't try to push them all forward at once. Start at the side away from the carriage. Hold the work down with your free hand and using the latch tool, push the tool into the first stitch. Pull it off the needle. push the tool into the next stitch. As you push forward, the first stitch will open the latch and slip behind it. Pull the tool back, grabbing the stitch off the needle. Pull the tool up till the second stitch is pulled through the first and it slips down off the tool. Continue doing this until you finish your cast off. When you come to the last stitch, you can remove the work from the machine and pull the tail of yarn right through the last stitch. One of the problems you may have when you begin to use a knitting machine occurs when you suffer from what I call DDY, or the dreaded droopy yarn disease. This can happen when you take the carriage some distance beyond the needles you're using to knit. Now you might have to do this because you've done some shaping or casting off, or because you've left the knitting for a while. What happens is that there is too much extra yarn for the take-up spring to pull up. And when you bring the carriage back to knit the next row, the yarn droops down below the sinker plate and gets caught up in the brushes. The solution is just to give it a helping hand. That is, pull it up gently as you begin to bring the carriage across the knitting. Let it go as soon as the needles begin to knit. Don't hold on to it, it'll droop. Don't pull it too tight while you're knitting, or the row will be too tight. You may find that you have knitted a row too many, and you may wish to unravel one. To do this, gently pull the yarn taut, pulling sideways on a line with the needle bed. Then rock the yarn out of the needle hooks. It's always advisable to keep your work well weighted while doing this. Occasionally, when you're unraveling a row, you may find that even though it is well weighted, some yarn has been caught on a gate peg or two. This is the best way to remove the loops of yarn from the gate pegs without pulling the work off your needles as well. Work on a small area at one time and use both hands. Place one hand firmly on the needle butts and pull back on them. At the same time, grab the knitting with your other hand and pull it in the opposite direction. Now, with both hands pulling away from each other, allow the work and the needles to slowly come forward, away from the front of the needle bed. At the same time, you can now lift the work gently off the gate pegs. Make sure all your gate pegs are free of yarn by pulling the work well away from the front of the machine. Still pulling apart with both hands, allow the work to return to its original position. One of the problems caused by droopy yarn can be a few dropped stitches at the beginning of a row. The best way of picking up any stitch is not to go for the stitch itself, but go for the stitch below. Put these back onto the needles. Always remember to keep the needles back in working position. This will help prevent the stitches from jumping off the needles while you're fiddling about with your knitting. Lift off the yarn from the stitches you've picked up. Push these needles to holding position. Open the latches. Place the yarn in the needle hooks. Close your latches. Pull all the needles back together a little bit so the stitches will keep the latches closed. You've now got a tunnel for the yarn. Then, with a finger on the needle butt, starting from one end, pull each needle back to working position one at a time. Occasionally, you may find a single dropped stitch. This is how you pick up and reform this single stitch. Start with your transfer tool and go for the stitch below the loop as you did when you lost several stitches. Put your latch tool upside down, feeding from the top of your work. The empty needle down behind until you can slip the eye of the transfer tool into the hook of the latch tool. Slip the stitch from the transfer tool onto the hook of the latch tool. Now it's quite easy. It's a matter of pushing, swiveling, grabbing a bar of yarn and pulling it up. Each one of these bars is a stitch. Push the tool down. The stitch slips behind the open latch. Swivel the tool so that you can grab a bar of yarn. Pull that bar of yarn back up and through the stitch, which will slip off the tool. Repeat this until you come to the last stitch. Slip the last stitch onto the empty needle. Another technique you will find quite useful is partial knitting. This means that even though you have the knitting on a group of needles, you don't have to knit all of them. You can knit part of the row and ignore the rest of the stitches. In this way, you can knit more rows on some of the stitches than others. In this sample, we will make the knitting on the right longer. With the carriage on the right, push a group of needles at the left to holding position. Set the holding cam lever on the carriage to H. Now, when you knit the row, the carriage will ignore the needles in holding position. To prevent a hole in your knitting, wrap the last needle in holding position. Take the yarn under this needle, then let it lie on top of the rest of the needles in holding position. When knitting back, give the yarn take-up spring a helping hand. Remember, you can only push a group of needles to holding position on the side of your work away from the carriage, never the same side of the work. Another way of preventing a hole is to push one needle less than the number you require to holding position on the side of your work opposite the carriage. Knit one row. Now push the last needle you need to holding position on the same side as the carriage. This is called automatic wrap. Notice you can only push one more needle to holding position on the same side as your carriage. Knit back, giving the yarn a helping hand again, and you won't get a hole. You can, of course, reverse the procedure and bring needles from holding position, or E, back to working position, or B. What you have to do is to push the needles opposite the carriage from holding position, or E, back to upper working position, or D. The open ends of the latches will line up with the edge of your machine. Of course, you must still remember to take precautions against getting holes by either wrapping or by putting an extra needle into holding position. Don't wait until you've knitted halfway up the front of your jumper to decide that you're not sure how to knit a neckline. It is a good idea to practice your necklines first on a sample piece. We're going to knit the right side of the neck and shoulder first. To do a simple round neck on a sample, with the carriage on the right, push all the needles on the left of 0 to holding position. For this sample, we'll use 24 needles for the front of the neck. Push 12 needles to the right of 0 for holding position, and set the carriage to holding position. Now begin to shape the neck by putting needles into holding position or E position while you're knitting. In this sample, I'm going to put 1 needle to holding position every row for the first 5 rows. Then I'll put a needle to holding position every other row 8 times. Because I'll push a needle to holding position on the same side as the carriage, I'll have an automatic wrap and I won't get a hole in my work. When I've finished doing all my shaping, I'll knit 7 rows straight for the side of the neck and remove the work onto a bit of waist knitting. Push the empty needles back to non-working position. Now, let's go back and knit the other side of the neck. Move the carriage over to the other side of your knitting. Leave all the needles to the right of 0 in holding position. Leave the 12 needles to the left of 0 in holding position. Push the remaining needles to the left of 0 back to upper working position. Thread up your main yarn and knit the second half of the neck, repeating the shaping in reverse. Remove the second shoulder onto waist knitting. Now, with your transfer tool, pick up each side neck onto the needles adjacent to the ones in holding position. Don't try to pick up individual loops of yarn, but just put your tool right through the edge of your work. Push all your needles to holding position. Set the holding cam lever to N and all your needles will knit. Knit one row with the main yarn and main tension. If you've already finished knitting the back, you can now pick it up onto the needles next to the front neck and knit your band, or you can remove the front neck onto waist knitting and add a band at a later date. If we want to knit a V-neck, we won't be able to shape it in the same way we did for the crew neck. We shall only knit one half of the neck at a time. This time we'll use the cast-on cord to hold the needles we don't want to knit. Knit these stitches one by one back to non-working position with the cord by hand. With your work carefully weighted, pull it down so it hangs below the needle bed. Then push the needles to holding position. Now you can knit the first half of your V-neck. When you have finished the first side of the neck, reset the carriage to knit. Knit one row with waste yarn and unravel it. Then unravel the cord, pulling the needles back into working position. Thread up your main yarn and knit the second half of your neck, repeating the shaping and reversing it. When you've finished knitting your garment, you will want to put it together. And one of the most important jobs you'll have is to put the neckline on it. Let's start with the round neckline. First, we have to put together one of the shoulder seams. For this method, we'll pick up the last row of main yarn loops before the waist knitting and place them onto the needles. We should place the work centrally on the machine. The right side of the garment is facing us. Fold the waist knitting back so you can see the main yarn loops. Knit one row main tension. Using your transfer tool, transfer every third stitch onto the needle next door. Push the empty needles back to non-working position. Start using main tension. I'm going to knit 8 rows and I'm going to decrease my tension 1 whole number every 2 rows. This will give me a neat finish to the band and it will sit nicely around the neck. For the fold row, knit 1 row on main tension plus 1. Then return to a small tension dial number and gradually increase by 1 whole number every 2 rows as you knit the second half of the band. 2 rows before the end of the band, push the empty needles back to working position. Knit 2 more rows. Measure 3 times the working needles with your yarn, then break it off. Remove the work from the machine onto waist knitting. When you have the work off, you can steam or press your waist knitting. Thread the tail of main yarn into a blunt needle for sewing knitwear. Fold the edge of the band down over the outside of the garment. Backstitch through the last row of main yarn loops. Now, here's the V-neck with one shoulder seam completed. This time, we're going to do the band in two separate sections. We'll do the long section first. That is, one side of the neck plus the back. Push up the number of needles you'll need for this longer band and cast on in waste yarn. Begin your hem on main tension -2. Knit the first half. I'm going to knit 8 rows. Knit a fold row on main tension +1. Then knit the second half, another 8 rows. Turn up your hem. Knit 1 row. Pick up the garment edge from the center front right round the back to the open shoulder seam with the wrong side of the garment facing you. Pull all your needles out to holding position as an insurance policy. Knit 1 row and cast off. Repeat for the shorter side. To make a buttonhole in the front band of a cardigan, you can either pick up the front of your garment or knit the band separately and add it afterwards. We'll start the band by casting on in waist knitting and knit the band first. My band is going to be 10 rows deep. I've cast on in waist yarn. After knitting 1 row with a cord, I'll thread up the main yarn and knit 5 rows in main tension -2. Decide where the buttonholes will be and push those needles to holding position. Make sure that all the latches are open and place a length of waste yarn in the needle hooks. Pull the needles back to make a tunnel for the yarn, then pull each needle back one by one to B position to make a row of stitches. Repeat this for each of the buttonholes. Knit 5 more rows on main tension -2. Knit 1 fold row on main tension +1, then 5 rows main tension -2. If you look at the stitches in waste yarn, there were 4 stitches. At the top of these stitches, you can see 5 main yarn loops, smiles. Starting at the right-hand side, pick up the first smile or stitch and place it on the first original buttonhole needle. Push that needle forward and pull the picked up loop through the stitch that's already on the needle. Transfer this stitch to the needle next door, which now has 2 stitches on it. Pick up the next smile and place it on this second needle. Push the needle forward so the 2 stitches fall behind the open latch. Then pull the picked up loop through the 2 stitches. Repeat until all 5 smiles have gone and you now have 4 empty needles. Now pick up the loops on the other side of your waste yarn stitches. There are 4 of them. These can now be placed on the empty needles. Repeat this for each buttonhole. When you've finished your buttonholes, knit the remaining 5 rows, main tension minus 2, to complete your band. Pick up the first row of main yarn loops, knit 1 row, pick up the garment edge with the wrong side facing you, knit 1 row, cast off. Now we'll look at patterning techniques. This simple electronic machine is very easy to use because it has 50 built-in patterns, and it also offers scope for the creative knitter by allowing you to design your own patterns up to 24 stitches in width and 998 rows in length. Once you've designed the stitches, they can be stored on a chip inside the machine until you decide to delete them. All stitch patterns can be placed anywhere you want them on your knitting. This is how we'll start a simple Fair Isle patterning technique. Turn the machine on and the ready lamp lights. Push the pattern number key, the ready lamp blinks and the pattern number lamp is lit. The display will show the previous pattern number unless the machine is brand new. Choose the pattern number by pushing the keys next to the up and down arrows. If you want to change the numbers quickly, push the fast button and the fast button light will come on. If you wish to cancel the fast button number selection, push the fast button again and the light will go off. We'll start with pattern number 3. Push the pattern number key to finish the selection and the ready light comes on again. Take your carriage outside the mark and turn the change knob. Take the carriage back across the knitting and you will knit a row and select the needles for the first row of your Fair Isle knitting. In the display window, you will see the row number light up. The direction of the carriage is indicated by the arrow light on the panel. Thread up the second colour yarn, push the multicolor button, and you're ready to knit your Fair Isle sample. Now I'll change the pattern position. I'm going to move the edge of the pattern across the knitting. First, I'll knit a repeat of the pattern as it is automatically positioned. The ready lamp is lit, press the pattern number button and the ready lamp blinks. Press the up or down key to choose the pattern number. I'm going to choose number 13. When I've selected my pattern number, press the button again and I'm ready to knit. If you want to knit the same pattern again, but you want to move it to the left or right on your needle bed so that it repeats with the left edge of the pattern beginning at another place in the knitting, this is what you do. This time when the ready lamp is lit, press the pattern position button. The number in the display window indicates the automatic position of the pattern. This pattern is 24 stitches wide. I'm going to move it over by 12 stitches. It says orange 12 at the moment. The numbers on the needle bed are numbered from 0 in the middle outwards. On the left they're orange, on the right they're green. So if I push the up or down key, I can change the left edge needle of the pattern. The lights at the top of the display indicate green and yellow of the needle bed. If I push the key, I can shift my pattern to the right. If I push the down key, I'll shift the pattern to the left. The fast key will move the selection more quickly. I'm going to move the left edge of my pattern to green 1 instead of yellow 12. I'll push the pattern position button again when the correct number is in the display window, and this will select the pattern position. The ready lamp comes on, and I'm ready to knit. The number in the display window indicates the row number of the pattern. If I want to confirm my selection, I can just push the pattern position button again, and the information is displayed in the window. On this knitted sample, you can see the repeat has been moved over. One of the most useful features of this machine is the ease with which you can program the machine to knit 1, 2, or 3 stitch pattern repeats automatically. This motif knitting is not used when knitting tuck stitch or slip stitch patterns, though. Begin by choosing your stitch pattern. When the ready light is lit, press the pattern number button and push the arrow key until the correct pattern number appears in the display window. This time I'll knit pattern 37. Choose the pattern number by pressing the pattern number button again. Select the pattern position by pressing the pattern position button when the ready light is lit. Push the up or down key to alter the left edge of the pattern in the display window. When the correct number and color light is displayed, select this by pressing the pattern position button again. Now you're going to tell the machine to knit 1, 2, or 3 repeats of the stitch pattern. You've already selected the left edge of the pattern. Press the point button. Hold this button down. While you hold it down, the information in the display window keeps changing. P1, P2, P3. This means the machine will knit 1, 2, or 3 repeats. When you lift your finger off the button, this is how you will select the number of repeats you're going to knit. Always knit the point motif with the lamp lit. When you're knitting point motifs, you may wish to alter the end needle selection on your carriage. Usually when knitting patterns, you have the end needles selected to upper working position automatically in order to get a neat edge on your fabric. If you're knitting a motif in the center of your work, you won't want the end needles to be selected because that will mean you'll get long floats in your Fair Isle knitting. To alter this end needle selection, you must remove the carriage from the machine and turn it upside down. Use your single transfer tool and place it in the center of this black screw and rotate them half a turn. This will cancel the automatic end needle selection. Once we've selected our pattern number, we can knit different types of fabric by selecting different buttons on the front of our carriage. We can knit a tuck stitch fabric by pushing the tuck buttons in. We'll also push the wheels on our sinker plate forward when we're knitting tuck stitch. To knit slip stitch fabric, we'll select the pattern in the same way as tuck stitch. We'll select pattern number 5. Take the carriage outside the mark, turn the change knob, bring the carriage back across the bed to select the needles, then push in both part buttons. With some of the patterns, we can change the yarn in our feeder and we'll get a multicolored effect. In Fair Isle knitting, we'll change the yarn in feeder B. Slip stitch knitting, we'll change the yarn in the main feeder when the memo window indicates a change. To knit weaving patterns on the machine, you've got to select the pattern first. I'll select pattern number 8. Take the carriage outside the mark, turn the change knob, bring the carriage back across the bed to select the needles, and now lower the weaving brushes on the sinker plate by pushing the 2 levers on the front of the plate up. We don't have to press any buttons on the front of our carriage. You can thread your weaving yarn through the tension mast, or alternatively, you can lie it across the needles that have been selected to upper working position. With any of your patterns, whether they're built-in or ones you've designed yourself, you can use the variation keys to alter their appearance. You set these keys after you have selected your stitch pattern. If we knit pattern number 13, we can see the effect these variations have on our knitting. To use the keys, make a note of the row number of the row before the change should occur. Button 1 is a negative positive button. 2 doubles the length of your pattern. 3 reverses the position of your pattern. 4, and you'll knit the pattern upside down, starting at the top and knitting down to the bottom. This last button is used when you're knitting double bed jacquard fabric when you use your ribber. As you know, you've got 50 built-in stitch patterns in this new machine, but you also have the possibility of designing your own stitch patterns. They can be up to 24 stitches wide, and you've got room for 998 rows. It's a good idea to draw your patterns out on a sheet of graph paper because you can keep a record of the pattern, and it will also help you when you're programming the machine. Start by pressing the input button. The machine gives your pattern a number. 901, the pattern number light comes on. Press the step button. The stitch light comes on. The machine tells you you have up to 24 stitches. I only need 5 stitches for this pattern, so I will move the light on to number 5. Press the step key and the row number light comes up. The machine is telling me I have room for 998 rows. Well, I only need 6. So I'll move that number to 6, press the step key, the data light comes on, and the cursor is flashing. The machine is asking me for information about my pattern. I will enter it by pressing these 2 buttons. I'll press the empty button for an empty square and the filled in square for a marked square on my graph. Start with an empty one, marked, empty, empty, empty. The loud beep tells me I finished row 1. Move on to row 2. The cursor light comes on. Empty, empty, marked, empty, empty. Row 2 is finished. Move on to row 3. Marked, empty, empty, marked, empty. Row 3 is finished. On to 4. Marked, marked, empty, empty, marked. Row 5. Marked, 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 empty, empty. My last row, marked, 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 empty. If I want to get the information again, all I have to do is press the arrow key and the cursor will move again. If I want to put color information into the memo window, all I have to do is, at the correct row number, press the memo button until the right number comes up. And if I don't want any information, I can press it again so that I have an empty window. And that is also stored in the machine. When I've finished programming the pattern, press the input button and the machine returns to normal. Now you're ready for knitting.